Chapter 19 Get rid of that guilt feeling. Pilot 19. You have a guilt feeling. That's good. But get rid of that feeling of guilt. A sense of guilt is good. And every living person, regardless of how good or bad he may be, will sometimes experience a feeling to guilt. This feeling is the result of a still, small voice speaking to you. And your conscience is that still, small voice. Now think for a moment, what would happen if one did not feel a sense of guilt after doing wrong? For the person who does not have a feeling of guilt for doing a specific wrong act is often unable to distinguish between right and wrong, or hasn't been trained to know the difference between right and wrong as regards that act. Or he may not be sane. For many feelings of guilt are inherited. And others are acquired. We know a mental conflict often will develop when inherited emotions and passions are bridled by the society in which one lives, and people in one environment may have an entirely different code to ethics that is opposed to the code of those in another. Yet in each instance where the individual has been taught a specific, ethical standard and violates it, he develops a feeling of guilt. In some instances, however, the violation of a moral standard of society is good because the standard itself may be bad. And we reiterate, a feeling of guilt is good. It even motivates persons of the highest moral standards to worthwhile thought and action. For there was a righteous man who hated and unrelentingly persecuted people of a religious minority. But he developed a feeling of guilt. And the world knows he righted his wrong when his feelings of guilt motivated him to desirable action. For he became a great evangelist. And his thoughts, words, and actions have changed the history of the world during the past 2,000 years. Saul of Tarsus was his name. And then there was a man whose feeling of guilt for what he believed to be the misdeeds of his life made him so remorseful that he, too, was motivated to desirable action. In prison he spent his days writing a book. And his book is a classic reference for teaching nobility of character and beauty of life. John Bunyan was his name. And then there was also the sinner we discussed in chapter 15 who donated $500,000 to the Chicago Boys Clubs and who also donated $1 million to his church. Now he did this to atone in part for his guilt. For he provided money to prevent boys and girls from falling into the traps and snares of life that he had experienced. Even a benefactor to mankind like Dr. Albert Schweitzer was motivated by the sense of guilt. For he felt guilty that he had fallen short of his responsibilities to his fellow men. And because he could, but was not, doing something worthwhile, his sense of guilt prompted him to start his great mission. Now do you see that a feeling of guilt with PMA is good? But then there is a feeling of guilt with NMA. And that is bad. For not every guilt feeling brings about beneficial results. Now when the individual has a guilt feeling and does not get rid of that guilt feeling with PMA, the results are often most harmful. And the great psychologist Sigmund Freud says, the further our work proceeds and the deeper our knowledge of the mental life of neurotics penetrates, the more clearly two new factors force themselves upon our notice which demand the closest attention as sources of resistance. They can both be included under the one description of need to be ill or need to suffer. The first of these two factors is the sense of guilt or consciousness of guilt. And Sigmund Freud is right. For feelings of guilt have motivated men to destroy their lives, mutilate their bodies, or injure themselves in other ways to atone for their wrongdoing. Now today, fortunately, such methods are seldom practiced. And they are not permitted in civilized countries. Yet their counterpart can be found. For the conscious mind may not feel guilty but the subconscious mind does. And the subconscious mind never forgets. And it uses its power as effectively as the conscious mind. For it fulfills the need of the individual who doesn't rid himself of the feeling of guilt with PMA. It makes him ill. It makes him suffer. A guilt feeling can teach you consideration for others. Consideration for others is a quality each of us has to learn to develop. The newborn babe cares little for the comfort and convenience of anyone else. He wants what he wants when he wants it. So right at that point in his development he begins to learn, little by little, that there are others alive, too, and that, to some extent at least, he will have to allow them some consideration. But selfishness is a common human trait, and it lessens in each of us only through development. When we get old enough to understand that such feelings are not good, we feel a twinge of guilt when we indulge in selfishness. This is good, for it causes us to think twice when the occasion arises and we can choose between pleasing ourselves or pleasing others concerned. Thomas Gunn's 6-year-old grandson was visiting him at his home in Cleveland, Ohio. The youngster would run to the corner every evening to meet his grandfather when he returned from work. This made the grandfather very happy. When the youngster met him, he would give his grandson a small bag of candy. One day the boy ran to the corner and greeted his grandfather in excitement and anticipation with, "Where's my candy?" The elderly gentleman tried to conceal his emotion. "Did you meet me every evening / he hesitated before continuing, "just for a bag of candy?" The boy was handed the small bag that his grandfather had taken out of his pocket. Nothing more was said as they walked to the house. The child was hurt. He was unhappy. He didn't eat the candy. It didn't seem desirable anymore. He had injured someone whom he loved. That night, as the 6-year-old and his grandfather knelt down and said their prayers aloud together, the youngster added one all his own, "Please, God, let grandfather know I love him." The boy's unhappiness and remorse because of what he had done were good. Why? Because they forced him to take action to get rid of that guilt feeling and make amends for what he had done. To get rid of that guilt feeling, make amends. Feelings of guilt can arise from many varied causes. But a sense of guilt brings with it a feeling of indebtedness that must be reduced and eliminated. And this is very well illustrated by the story of the young doctor in Lloyd C. Douglas' novel The Magnificent Obsession. For you will recall that in that story the young man who is the hero felt that he owed the world a debt because his me had been saved at the cost of the life of a great brain surgeon who had been a real blessing to the world. But it was this feeling of debt which caused the young man to become a brain specialist equal in ability to the man whose me he felt he had taken. And from the diary of the man who had gone on, the young man learned a philosophy of me which caused him to develop a magnificent obsession. Thus, because of his guilt feeling, he too became a worthwhile person. Now every story is somebody's story. And every day in your daily newspaper you read somebody's story, someone like Jim Voss whose me was saved in more ways than one because he responded to an irrevocable decision to get rid of his feeling of guilt. For he got into action. To get rid of that guilt feeling, get into action. Sometimes people get caught in a web of wrongdoing, and they seem to be unable to free themselves from it. For they give up trying. And then they become more and more entangled, until finally it takes an almost earth-shaking experience to set them free. Such was the case with Jim Voss. Jim Voss is a man who terribly owes his me to his decision to say I will, and yet this decision came quite late in life. For a good many years, Jim had been running head-on into the commandments. He seemed to be trying to violate them all, one by one. The first time he broke the injunction, "Thou shalt not steal," he was still in college. One day he stole $92.74, he went to the airport, bought a ticket, and headed for Florida. A little later he stole again, this time in an armed robbery. He was caught and put in jail. Shortly thereafter he was granted amnesty so that he could join the army, yet even in the army he got into trouble. The court-martial read, "For diverting government property to private use." And so it went. Jim Voss' career kept sliding downhill. The more often he did wrong, the more guilt he felt. Guilt leads to guilt, as well as lies and deception to hide it. Now Jim didn't consciously feel more guilty because his conscious sense of guilt had become deadened. But not so with his subconscious mind. For that's where the guilt feeling accumulated without Jim's realizing it. And, as in the instances you often read of in your newspaper, it took an earth-shaking experience to awaken him. Now Voss was eventually released from the army, he married and moved to California where he set up an electronics consultant business. One day a man known simply as Andy came to Jim and outlined a big idea for beating the races with an electronic device. Within weeks Jim was deeply involved with the underworld. And he was driving a $9,000 car. He had a fine home at the suburbs, and more business than he could handle. One day Jim had an argument with his wife. She wanted to know where all the money was coming from, and he wouldn't say. So she started to cry. Jim couldn't stand to see his wife cry. For he loved her. Jim's conscience bothered him. Because he wanted to humor her, he suggested a ride out to the beach. On the way, they got caught in a traffic jam. Hundreds of cars were pouring into a parking lot. "Oh look, Jim," said Alice. "It's Billy Graham. Let's go. It might be interesting." And still trying to humor her, Jim went along. But shortly after he sat down he became emotionally disturbed. It seemed to him that Graham was talking directly to him. For Jim's conscience bothered him so badly that it seemed he had been singled out. Graham's text was, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul?" Then Graham was saying, "There's a man here who has heard all this before, who is hardening his heart. With pride he stiffens his neck, and he is determined to leave without making a decision. But this will be his last chance." His last chance? To Jim the thought was startling. Perhaps he had a premonition. Or perhaps he was ready. What did the preacher mean? Graham was giving a call to come forward. He wanted people to take a physical step that symbolized a decision. What was happening, Jim wondered. Why did he feel like crying? Suddenly he found himself speaking. "Let's go, Alice." Dutifully Alice walked to the aisle, and turned as if to go out of the tent. Jim, who was following carried her, caught her arm and turned her around. "No, dear," he said. "This way." Years later, after Jim had changed his life completely, he was giving a speech in Los Angeles. And then he told of his experiences with the underworld. He told about the day of his decision, on which day he had been instructed to fly to St. Louis on a wiretapping assignment. "I never reached St. Louis," he said. "I found the courage to reach my knees instead." And in his speech Jim told of his blessings and how he had I thanked God for them, asked for forgiveness, had tried to neutralize his wrongdoing, and stressed the application of the golden rule. After the lecture, a lady came up to him and said, "Mr. Voss, one think you might like to know something. I was working in the mayor's office at the time you were supposed to go to St. Louis. On that day a teletype was received from the FBI. It said, Mr. Voss, that you were going to be met in St. Louis by a rival gang. And shot dead. A recommended formula for getting rid of guilt. Your own last chance may not be as dramatic as this. But there is a wonderful lesson in the story of Jim Voss, nonetheless. How was Jim able to get rid of his guilt feelings? He did it by following a clear-cut pattern. It is the pattern all of us can follow. First of all, you listen as you hear advice, a lecture, an inspirational sermon that could change your life. Then you count your blessings, and thank God for them. Feel sincerely sorry and ask for forgiveness. When you realize your blessings, it isn't difficult to become sincerely sorry for the wrongs you have done. And truly to repent. Then you will have the courage to ask for forgiveness from God. You must take the first step forward. This is important because it is a symbol through a physical gesture that you make in the direction of a changed life. When Jim walked down the aisle, he was making a public announcement that he had become sorry for his past and was now ready to change his life. Also, you must make amends by taking the second step forward, begin immediately to right every wrong. And then the most important step of all, apply the golden rule. This should be easy. For now when you are tempted to do wrong, that still, small voice will whisper to you. And when it does, stop and listen. Count your blessings. Picture yourself in the other fellow's place. and then make your decision to do what you would want done if you actually were in his position. So this is the formula for getting rid of your guilt feelings. If you are having trouble with temptation, and if subsequent guilt is keeping you from using your energy in a constructive direction, learn the pattern for freedom from guilt. Relate it to your own life. Apply it, and step away toward success. Success through a positive mental attitude urges you to use the powers of your conscious and subconscious mind to seek the truth, motivate you to take constructive action, cause you to strive to achieve the highest ideals you can conceive, live intelligently in your society, help you abstain from that which will cause unnecessary injury, start you from where you are and get you to where you want to be regardless of what you are or what you have been. Anything which deters you from noble achievements in life should be cast aside. And this places upon you the burden to know or find out what is right or wrong, and to know what is good or evil under a given circumstance and at a given time. You are acquainted with the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and other standards of good in the society in which you live. And it is for you to determine the standards which will guide you to your desired goals. It is one thing to know the goal, and quite another thing to work toward it, writes Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen in Life is Worth Living. Choose your goal. Work toward them. Direct your thoughts, control your emotions, get into action and you ordain your destiny. You can find the answer if you keep seeking it. How? One important aid is to catch character. Catch. Character is something that is caught, not taught, was a thought-provoking quotation of Arthur Berger, executive director of the Boys Clubs of Boston. It appeared in a Reader's Digest article entitled 400,000 Boys Are Members of the Club. Catch has 2 distinct meanings: 1, affected by exposure to environment, often subconscious reaction, and 2, seize and hold, conscious action. One effective way to catch character is to place yourself or your children in an environment that will develop desirable thoughts, motives, and habits. If your selected environment is not sufficiently effective after a reasonable time, make substitutions and changes. But character can also be taught. And if parents would devote more time to teaching character, both by precept and example, their children would catch and learn this admirable quality so necessary for success. What makes a delinquent? E. Bauermeister, supervisor of education at the California Institution for Men at Chino, California, says, our youngsters need the guidance in choosing right from wrong which they should receive at home. When we start talking about juvenile delinquency, we should rename it and put the responsibility where it belongs. We have a case of parent delinquency in America today. Parents are not assuming the obligations and responsibilities that are theirs. Everyone has been born with a potential of good character. J. Edgar Hoover made the statement, you can read volumes upon volumes as to the cause of crime, but crime is literally caused by the lack of one thing, a feeling of moral responsibility on the part of people. And the reason the people lack a feeling of moral responsibility is because they lack a guilt feeling. Thus they do not develop their own characters, for their conscience is dulled and doesn't guide them. And from their faulty immoral and amoral characters their children can neither catch nor learn character. When one virtue is in conflict with another, sometimes it is not so easy to decide whether one should say yes or no. For the question to be resolved may involve a conflict between virtues. And every person at some time is faced with such a conflict and must make a decision. He must choose, between what he wishes to do and what he ought to do, or between what he wants and what society expects of him. And such a choice must necessarily be made between virtues, such as love, duty, and loyalty. As examples: A. Love and duty to a parent in conflict with the love and duty to a husband or wife. B. Loyalty to an individual in conflict with loyalty to another individual. Or C. Loyalty to an individual in conflict with loyalty to an organization or society. Let's illustrate with the story of the salesman who worked with George Johnson. For they were faced with a conflict between loyalty to an individual and loyalty to another individual and the organization he represented. George Johnson trained, encouraged, inspired, and financed a salesman whom we will call John Black. George had complete confidence in John. He liked him. He gave him a break. He let him service his best customers' long-established accounts. In the company contract it was agreed that in the event of termination the salesman would in no way molest the company's business or interfere with its sales organization. Mr. Johnson gave Black the book Think and Grow Rich. It motivated John to action the wrong action. John didn't read what was unwritten. His only interest was the acquisition of money. He believed the end justified any means. Because of his negative standards he responded aggressively with a negative mental attitude. George Johnson is just like a father to me. Yes, I think of him as a father, the salesman said, but at the same time he secretly planned to transfer the company's customers and sales force to a competing concern for money. John was welcomed in the homes of his fellow salesmen. For they were unaware of his thoughts or plans. When he called at their homes he relied upon the honesty and decency of the individuals to live up to a promise and not to betray his secret. He would ask, "How would you like to double your earnings? How would you like to have greater security?" The response would be, "Sounds good. What's it all about?" Black would answer, "I don't want anyone to upset the apple cart, therefore, I'll tell you only if you promise me on your honor not to tell anyone. Do you make a solemn promise?" When the answer was yes, he endeavored to entice them over to the competing organization. He tried to neutralize their pangs of conscience by referring to real or imaginary dissatisfactions. The other salesmen were on the spot. On the one hand, they had given John their solemn promise not to tell what he was doing. On the other hand, they knew what he was doing would be harmful to their employer. And they owed a greater loyalty to George Johnson and the organization he represented. The salesman had the courage to try to clear the cobwebs of John's thinking and to show him that what he was contemplating was not right. When he didn't respond but persisted in his own way, they knew what to do. They gave George Johnson the facts. They chose adherence to the virtue of loyalty to their employer. As Abraham Lincoln once put it, they chose to stand with anyone that stands right, stand with him while he is right and part from him when he goes wrong. These salesmen showed their true characters when they made their decision. They showed that they were men of courage, honesty, and loyalty. They knew how to decide between right and wrong when one virtue was in conflict with another. There are many such conflicts. In your me you will be faced with the necessity to make decisions in instances where virtues are in conflict with other virtues. And what will your decision be? Perhaps the following will aid you. Do that which your conscience tells you will not develop a guilt feeling. It's the right thing to do. To assist you in coming to the right decision under such circumstances, complete the success quotient analysis in the following chapter. Get rid of that guilt feeling. 223. Pilot. 19. Thoughts to steer by. Get rid of that guilt feeling. 1. You have a guilt feeling. That's good. But get rid of that guilt feeling. 2. To get rid of that guilt feeling, make amends. 3. A recommended formula to help you get rid of guilt is: A. Listen to advice, a lecture, sermon, etc., and relate and assimilate the principles. B. Count your blessings and thank God for them. C. Then become truly sorry for your wrongdoings. True sorrow necessarily incorporates a sincere decision to stop the wrongdoing. D. Take the first step forward, acknowledge your guilt and your intention to make amends. E. Make amends insofar as you are able. F. Apply the golden rule. 4. Anything which deters you from noble achievements in life should be cast aside. 5. Character can be caught and taught. 6. What do you do when two virtues are in conflict with one another? 7. The burden is upon you to find what is right or wrong, and to know what is good or evil under a given circumstance and at a given time. You have a guilt feeling. That's good. But get rid of that guilt feeling.